In this part of our tutorial, I'm going to show you different ways to index with a for loop. So I'm going to show you different ways to different start and end points and basically different indexing. So we know for loops have a start point and then a semicolon, the end point, which means the point at which it runs until, and then another semicolon, and then the index. So we can modify any one of those three or all three if we want to produce different results. So we're going to change the initial value of I, the final value of I, or the value it runs until, and the element of an array that it accesses, because we're going to feed it a character array. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at accessing elements of an array again, but instead we're going to use different indexing. So up until this point, we've started at 0 each time, and we've only increased by 1. So now we're going to show you some different ways we can access elements within an array using a for loop. So I think the easiest way to demonstrate this might be a character array. So we're going to call this mammoth, and you know what it's going to contain, because we're using the same one every time. And there we go. I should really just copy and paste this. We use it so often. And then we're going to have this, and we're going to have this. Okay, so we've initialized our array to contain these characters. Alright, so now we want to actually modify it. So let's start our for loop. And so we'll start first at I was 0. So we're again going to start at the beginning, but we're going to access every other element. So we'll go until I less than array length. So this is going to be mammoth.length. And it might be a good practice to get into the habit of calling your array length rather than the number that corresponds with the length. So rather than writing 7, it might be a good idea to actually type out mammoth.length, because we might make a mistake, whereas this way the computer knows exactly what to do. Plus, again, if you don't know how long the array is, then this is the only way really to do it, unless you want to count every element. Okay, so then we are going to do I equals I plus 2 this time. So we've seen before this exact same thing, but printed when we had I equals I plus 1. So this just goes through the elements one at a time, starting at 0, then 1, then 2, up until 7. Goes through them one at a time and prints them out. This time we're skipping over every other one. So we'll print out the first one, then the third, then the fifth, and then the seventh. So we'll be skipping some characters. And this is just to demonstrate that you can go through an array, don't have to go through the array every single element at a time. We can kind of skip and we can index however we want. So let's do what we were doing before. So we're just going to print this and turn it into a string. So let's create the string here. It's going to be string mammoth string. And it's usually a good idea, where possible, to create these global variables, because then we can call them within multiple functions. Okay, so then we're just going to say mammoth string is mammoth string of I dot to, well, it's going to be, no, this isn't right. It's going to be mammoth string plus mammoth, and that will be at index I. Okay, and we're going to convert this to string. And you see this kind of grayish text? It says redundant cool, but we're going to leave it in just in case. Okay, so just to recap, this is taking our, well, on the first iteration it'll be blank, but it's taking our current string and it's going to add to that current string the character at the index specified by the iteration of the loop, and that's going to be converted to a string, so at the end it will just create one string with all the characters appended. However, instead of increasing by 1 and getting all 7 characters, we're going to skip every other character. So let's go ahead and print this out at the very end. This is in iOS, it will be label and text, and we're going to say it's equal to mammoth string. Okay, so this is good to go, and we are going to run it again with the iPhone 5S. Alright, build successful, that's what I like to see. And here we go, it's starting up. Just going to take a little while, clearly. There we go. Okay, and instead of the nice string mammoth, we're only printing every other one, so we get MMOH, because, again, starting at 0, then we're going to the element index 2, then index 4, then an index 6. Okay, so this is an example of skipping every other element. We're going to stop that. Now, let's say we're going to increase by 1 this time, but we want to start in the middle of the array. So let's say 3. So this is going to print out the element index 3 and onwards. So this is going to be moth it's going to print out. Okay, so let's see this in action. And this is good if you want only, for example, half of the array, or maybe we don't want to, we can start at the beginning and run maybe not necessarily all the way to the end. So here we get moth, again because we're starting at the element index 3 and only printing those, the last 4. Okay, now we're going to start at index 0, but we're going to only print out the first 4 elements. Okay, so let's run this again. So you see how I'm modifying this each time? So again, this is the starting point, this is the end point, and this is the index. So changing this will change how the for loop iterates through the index, rather iterates through the array. It will change which elements it accesses. This will change how soon it ends. So if it's the array length, then it will run until the very end of the array. And this changes where the for loop starts, so the starting point of our array. Okay, and we get MAMM printed out because we're starting at 0 and only running until 4. Okay, that's all good. So let's change this back to length. So this is mammoth.length. Okay, and now we're going to do something a little crazy here. We're going to start at the very end, so when I equals 6, and we're going to run until I is greater than or equal to 0, and I'll explain exactly what I'm doing in just a second. I'm going to do I equals I minus 1. So now instead of starting at 0 and running up, we're going to start at the end, which will be element at index 6, and we're going to run backwards. So we're basically just printing this array out backwards, starting from 6 and running through till 0. And the reason I did the greater than or equals to is if I just did the greater than, it would stop at A, because it would exit the loop once we're at index 0. So that's why I have to include the equals there. And this time we're counting down. Notice the I equals I minus 1 instead of I plus 1. Okay, so let's see what this looks like. We'll go ahead and run it again. And we'll see what prints out. Hopefully it should print out the array, but backwards. And that's exactly what's happening. So we get this, this interesting word here, which is just mammoth backwards. Okay, so this is just a few examples of how to access different elements within an array in different ways. So we can have a different starting point of our for loop by modifying this part. We can have a different end point of our for loop by modifying this part. And we have a different indexing by modifying this part. So for loops are pretty dynamic in that you can access different elements at different times. So again, we can start at the beginning, start at the end, start at the halfway point, and we can finish wherever we want, and we can index however we want. It doesn't have to be starting at 0, running until the end of the array, and indexing by 1 each time. There's a lot of different stuff we can do. In this part of our tutorial, I showed you different ways to index with a for loop. So this means we accessed elements in different orders within the character array. So we started out by accessing every other element, then we had a different start point, then a different end point, and then finally we switched the whole thing around and printed the array out backwards rather than forwards. So by now you should be able to modify indexing to have a different start and end points and have different indexing. So this means modifying the initial value of I, the value until that the loop runs until, and the indexing factor.